Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, welcome to this policy dialogue that we are proud to co-host with the European Economic and Social Committee and also the European Environment Bureau. This meeting at this particular point in time and in this year 2015 is not just a routine meeting. Indeed, for many of you who have followed just a few weeks ago the rather unusual enthusiasm that I think we saw emanate from the General Assembly Hall in the United Nations in New York points to the fact that in the context of the sustainable development arena and also policy agenda, we have seen some rather remarkable developments. In that sense, I want to begin by pointing to those as also a reason for both encouragement and acknowledgement. Encouragement in the sense that I believe that in the year 2015, for many of you and certainly for us in UNEP, we have reached a point where the sustainable development agenda has matured. New York was not just a routine adoption of a set of goals and agenda points. It marks truly an evolution in both the maturity and also the ambition of a sustainable development agenda that has now been negotiated by the 193 member states of the United Nations. You and many will recall that when in 1992 at the Earth Summit we first worked with those three pillars of sustainable development, the economic, the environmental and social, we found ourselves in some ways encouraged by a new vision for development, but also in another sense entrapped in these three pillars or three silos, where the economic remained the dominant, the social sometimes was looked to, particularly when social discord forced societies to address inequity and other drivers of social inequality. But the environmental pillar remained very often the one that we should look at, but in a chronological sense once we had solved other problems. We have paid a heavy price for this logical chronology of the last 20 years, and it is one that remarkably was challenged ultimately at the Rio+20 summit. To some, the outcome document, The Future We Want, remained a very abstract document and perhaps a summit at a moment in time when the world wasn't ready for a big step forward. But sometimes summits and outcome documents hold surprising elements within them. And I think few of us would have expected the journey from Rio+20 to now the year 2015 and September this year in New York, leading to a new 2030 agenda for sustainable development and a set of 17 sustainable development goals that are qualitatively different. Two issues that many of you will already have reflected on stand out: universality. And in the context of the policy dialogue that you are holding now with major groups and stakeholders across Europe, this is particularly relevant. Not only in terms of a leadership role that Europe often cites and also rightly claims in trying to address the challenge of economic, social and environmental sustainability in its own development vision and pathway, but also in the sense of challenging itself to not be too complacent, that those 17 sustainable development goals imply a significant challenge also in terms of domestic European action and also in taking responsibility in a planetary context for the kind of footprint, economic, social and environmental, that Europe represents with its over 500 million citizens, its economy, and ultimately with its opportunity to act or not to act. I also said it is an opportunity for acknowledgement because the 2030 agenda is not only a moment in which we have a global community adopting a set of goals, it was also an illustration of how vital civil society, the scientific community, but also leaders, progressive leaders in the business community were to this process. For the United Nations, the 2030 agenda and the SDGs represented an unprecedented engagement of the public at large across the globe. But I want to particularly pay tribute to the environmental community because without it and without its very active engagement in this process, we may not have arrived at another very distinguishing characteristic of this new agenda: its level and degree and ambition in terms of integration. We now have a set of sustainable development goals that never before has been as diligent and as ambitious in trying to link these three dimensions and traditionally silos of sustainable development action. I think for me, as Executive Director of UNEP, the year 2015 truly represents a milestone that you can also trace back to the 1972 Stockholm Conference that led to the establishment of UNEP. It has been a 4-decade-long struggle and journey in the public policy arena, in the civil society movement, in the world of economic decision-making, to recognize that there is no future for 7 and soon 10 billion people on this planet that is premised on the notion of trade-offs as the only rationale for making public policy, investment decisions, or indeed decisions in any sector, be it energy, land use, recycling and waste management. The combination of the economic, the social and the environmental is fundamental to actually having a prospect for development in the future. And that is a message that I think you need to continue to carry into the European policy arena, but also through actions and leadership in Europe into the global policy arena. I also believe that no agenda and no set of sustainable development goals is likely to have much of an impact if it remains an abstract global aspiration. The future of this agenda, the relevance of the SDGs will be defined by the degree and the speed with which we can domesticate them, socialize them in the context where people make real decisions and the consequences of those decisions are visible, where real opportunities for action arise. And therefore, the first point of reference must be in our societies, in our communities, but also in our cities, our municipal legislative assemblies, our national parliaments. It is when the executive and the legislative begin to have a discourse around the Sustainable Development Goals and with civil society and the public at large monitoring and scrutinizing the progress or lack thereof, that the SDGs will become part of the fabric of national development planning, debate, and also ambition. In that sense, the role that many of you will play in the coming months and years in the European region in particular is central to making sure that what happened this September in New York in the General Assembly Hall does not remain in the realm of documented ambition. Let me also, since tomorrow you will focus on another platform that will convene next year here in Nairobi in May, the United Nations Environment Assembly. I want to appeal to you to look very carefully at what the potential significance of this new Environment Assembly within the United Nations represents. It will only be the second convening of UNEA after the decision in Rio to establish a universal membership Environment Assembly in the United Nations. A remarkable development, one that is full of promise but no guarantee that it automatically translates into concrete impacts and consequences. Not only do we need Europe as a region firmly and actively and proactively engaged in setting the agenda and also in defining the ambition of the environmental dimension of this post-2030 agenda and also of the environmental DNA strand, if you want, in the Sustainable Development Goals. We need civil society, we need business leaders, we need academicians and the scientific community to view the United Nations Environment Assembly as what I hope it will one day be known, the Parliament of the world for the environment under the United Nations, where neither size of economy or political power alone define the right to be represented and for voices to be heard. The importance of having small island developing nations, small economies, African nations, Latin American nations, alongside the European, North American and Asian giants of our global economy, be seated together in a hall and define not only the necessity to act in terms of the science and what it is that we know has to happen, but also to forge the kind of alliances, shared trust and belief in the capacity to act together is going to be a hallmark, I hope, of what UNEA can facilitate, catalyze, and amplify in the years to come. Let me also end briefly by making reference to a very significant process that is still to happen this year, the Paris Climate COP. Many of you, I know, are looking at the weeks in November and December with a great deal of concern, and rightly so. We have taken well over 20 years to try and bring a collective response to an ever more threatening prospect of global warming and climate change to become a reality. I would like to appeal to you that in the weeks leading up to Paris, we do not engage in a doom and gloom scenario, but rather that we encourage leaders in public policy, in the business world, the economic world, and also in our communities and societies to recognize Paris for what it is. Yet another milestone, yet another stepping stone in a very complex and challenging and sometimes painfully disappointing journey that, however, is attempting something unprecedented in the history of modern humanity. Aligning, synchronizing, and accelerating the efforts of 7 billion people in moving towards a low-carbon economy, and hopefully somewhere in the second half of this century, a zero net emissions global economy. This is an unprecedented project in terms of economic transformation, but also in terms of geopolitical consensus building. I would like to encourage you to not only look at the struggles and yes, sometimes also bitter failures of the negotiating process that is an inevitable hallmark of this convention platform. Something else has happened just in the last few weeks that should make us sit up and realize how vital, how profound, and how in the long term absolutely irreplaceable this convention process and platform is to our common future. The INDCs, the national climate strategies that have just been released and presented to the world by over 150 nations, are not simply documents. They mark a significant milestone in the evolution of the convention. We now have, for the first time, 90% of the world's emissions being managed in a low carbon and decarbonization pathway as never before. The UNFCCC has just become a universal convention. The debates over the last 20 years between North and South, large countries, emitting countries, are being overtaken by the realization that the compelling argument for acting together is beginning to prevail. Paris will still be complicated. Paris could still have setbacks, for instance, also on this equation of action and commitment and financing. But let me be very clear. I believe that many of the countries in the global south have made an extraordinary step forward. It is in many ways an act of faith in the international community and its promise that solidarity, collaborative action, and also, yes, financial resources will be part of the equation of this significant change in pace and also commitment to act together. Let us use the next few weeks to put the pressure on all leaders, North and South, but also in the business world, in the energy sector, the transport sector, and essentially all parts of our economy, to not let Paris be turned into another theater of disagreement. We will not get the perfect outcome in Paris. We know already that even all the INDCs that are now on the table will not guarantee us a 2-degree pathway as yet, colleagues. But it is a significant step forward, and it speaks to the continuous curve of acceleration that we have seen in the last 15 to 20 years, in which national action by different players in our societies and economies do add up to acceleration. And it is critical that we retain that global framework, the convention, and the confidence that it ultimately can enable greater ambition to succeed. So please do use the next 2 days to reflect on the significance of what is happening around us, the central role that Europe plays in that potential new future, whether it is related to climate change or the broader sustainable development agenda. And please do also reflect on the vital role and contribution that, particularly as major groups and stakeholders, you will also need to play next year in the United Nations Environment Assembly. Without your presence, without your agenda-setting function, and without your engagement already from now onwards, including through our new portal that hopefully will be useful to you, myunea.org, which is our attempt to try and make a major groups and stakeholder engagement for UNEA rise to a whole new level of activity and also quality. Without that engagement, I think we would not be able to look to UNEA2 next May here in Nairobi as another milestone in that journey where the environmental dimension of sustainable development, but also the science and the environmental governance and rule of law remain integral to the prospect for a better future. Thank you for allowing me to join you, at least by means of this video message. And again, thank you to our partners also in Europe for the extraordinary friendship, partnership and support that you have given to this very unique program in the United Nations system and ultimately to our common future. Thank you.